Okay, for this project, we're going to be painting the pumpkin still life in value, meaning that we'll be painting that in black and white. And so step number one was to take a photo of at least three objects. You could have more than three, but at least three. And take the photo and then change that photo into black and white. And this is the photo that you will be working on throughout. And so step number one is that I just set up the laptop in front of me so that I can see it. And I'm going to use a pencil. Whoops, sorry about that. I'm going to use a pencil. To very, very lightly go in, and I'm going to draw out where the objects are. So again, I'm looking at the photo. I'm just very, very lightly drawing them out, almost as circles or ovals. The pumpkins are kind of oval shaped. And I'm just drawing out where they are on the page. That way, if they're not in the correct area, it's a lot easier to change these lines. I'm noticing that they're touching here, the squash and the pumpkin, and then this squash goes behind this pumpkin, so I'm making sure to draw it very lightly, just kind of the area of the paper, the composition that I want. I notice there's a bit of a separation between these two pumpkins, just very, very slight. And then also I'm going to lightly draw in where the shadows are. So again, it's very, very light. It's just these sort of circles and oval shapes as you start. Then I'm going to go back. I'm going to start with, maybe I'll start with the stem over here on this side. Notice it's not sticking right out of the pumpkin because the angle that I took the photo, that it's actually is about here. And then the stem is going this way. Thicker, then it goes thinner. Then there's actually one area that's lighter on top, and this part's darker. It sort of twists around like the vine. And then I'm going to start looking at the sort of contour lines that make up the pumpkin, because again, it's not completely rounded like a tomato. It has these sort of segments to it. This one comes around. I'm just going to keep, again, looking at the picture, and I'm drawing what I see in the picture. Not what I know about a pumpkin, but what I see. All right? A lot of people will just draw these sort of symbols of like a scalloped looking pumpkin and go, oh, that's a pumpkin. That's the symbol from elementary school that we always drew, that's what represents a pumpkin. But in this case, we're actually looking at the objects and looking at them as still life objects rather than as the symbol. We're looking at the real thing, not the symbol. Okay. So there's just very, very lightly sketched in there where that pumpkin's going to be. And then the other stem is over here. This is a real pumpkin, so it has quite a lot of character to the stem here. It sort of goes up, it twists around. It has this broken piece at the top. All right. Part of it goes over here. And then I'll start drawing that in. And drawing around the edges here. Now, once you go back through, you're going to do that. You're going to come up with a contour line drawing. So this one's a bit more cleaned up of a contour line drawing. And notice I don't have any black and white added yet. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be painting and putting in the values. And this is how my palette is set up here. You'll notice that I've got 2 dabs of white. Remember, don't put out a huge puddle of paint. This is just slightly larger as far as the white. The white's probably going to be the largest area of paint that you have. Notice it's like 2/4 worth for each puddle. And then with the color, you can probably even do less than a quarter's worth, maybe even a dime's worth, all right? You only need a tiny, tiny amount to be able to tint that white paint there. And that's what we're gonna be doing, tints, tones, and shades, tints, tones, and shades when we're using black and white and one color. And so I'm gonna start with the lightest areas, and then I'm gonna work my way to the darker areas, okay? And the reason we do this is because as you start with your lightest areas, and almost every painting that you do, always start with the lightest, and then work your way toward the darks and the shadows. And the reason is because it's easier for those darker tints and darker tones to go over the lighter ones. All right, so I'm gonna start with the ones here on this pumpkin here and this pumpkin here. And again, notice how I've got a couple different ones, and the reason is I'm gonna mix up a few different shades of gray so I can blend as I go. A tiny, tiny bit of black. You see, that's a very, very small amount, very small amount. And even that is gonna create, see, that creates kind of a mid-tone, almost a mid-tone gray. And so then I'm gonna just take some of that. Again, I left some of the other white. I'm gonna just take a little bit of that, mix that in. Now I'm making even a lighter because I used the gray to mix. Then I'm gonna take this tiny, tiniest bit of blue, because I like to have a blue, kind of a bluish tint to the grayscale. It just gives it a little bit more depth to it. You could see that was a tiny bit. It's always good to mix with a palette knife. The mixing knives are the ones that have the handles that go down like this, all right? So you'll see that here's another mixing knife where they go down and they're sort of curved like that so that you're able to mix it. The ones that are straight all the way across, those are more so for painting, when you can paint with a palette knife, which we will do later. Again, I'm just gonna put a drop, even that's too much. Tiny, tiny bit. Look at that. Very, very small amount. You see, and that blends in. It gives a nice sort of light bluish tint to our grayscale. It just gives a little bit more depth as we're painting. Now, I've got a couple different tints. I may mix up one more here. This one I'm adding a bit more black. Start getting into some of those shadows. But you see how I'm pre-mixing them. It's gonna be helpful as you're blending, all right? Rather than trying to blend here on the palette and then try and match that blending over here, it's better to have it pre-mixed, already mixed up tints, tones, and shades. And that way it's just a lot easier to blend on the paper. So again, I'm gonna use my lighter tint that I mixed up. I'm gonna start with some of these highlights that are up there. When I look at this, I see that they're around, oh, my picture's about to go. They're around up here. These are all of my highlights up here. So I'm just gonna dab in some of those highlights in there. And you'll notice that it's light enough, I can still see my pencil lines. I'm not completely covering over the pencil lines. Still see them. I'm just gonna blend just a little bit of that lighter color into there. Same thing over here, there's light over here. There's light here. There's some light on this one, on this side, on this side. So again, I'm just looking at where those lights are, or highlights. And remember, if I go to an area and it ends up being at the end of the painting, I go, oh wait, that area was too dark. Because remember, your paint dries just a slightly bit darker. And you're thinking, oh, that was too dark, I should have gone lighter. You can always then go in with your highlights and just kind of highlight a few things here and there. All right. Now I'm gonna switch to my other, this sort of mid-tone one, start putting that in. And you'll see that because it's still wet, it blends very nicely. There's a nice blending. I can have a second brush kind of ready to go over here on the side. I've got a thinner brush, just make sure it's clean. It's always good to have a paper towel and a cup of water to clean out your brushes. But you can see I can use that dryer brush just to sort of fan this in, blend it in. And let's see where some of our shadows are in here. So I'm looking at where the shadows are. Okay, there's shadows over here. Over here. And you'll notice that I'm going outside the lines. I'm going into that shadow area down here. That's okay, because eventually I'm going to be using a darker shades and tones, right? So it's going to cover right over top of that. So I'm not worried about going outside the lines. Now over here it starts to get a bit darker shades. And of course darker shades over here on the gourd. I'm just going to start to block those in a little bit. I'm going to paint around this very shiny highlight. So this isn't only the shadow, but it's also that color of the gourd. I'm representing the color, and that's why it's a good thing to change your photo to black and white before you start painting, so that you can see what are the underlying tints and tones of this. What does this color green look like as in grayscale? So that way you can start to mix those grayscales together. All right, there's a little highlight there, right there. And there's some shadow areas up here. I'm just going to sort of brush that out some so I can paint into it. I'm going to go back to my midtones. I'm adding some of the midtones in there, back in. All right, so again, the idea is that I'm going to continue adding, getting a little bit darker, a little bit darker. Some of the last areas I'm going to be doing are those dark shadows, which are going to be mainly, I'm going to start with that dark gray, and I'm going to add just a little bit of black into that. Maybe some blue. Oh, I don't want to go too blue. But maybe there's some reflective light. We get that reflective blue light. And you'll see that cast shadow is right underneath the pumpkin. And there's a double shadow because of the way that we have the lights in the room and then the strong light of the clamp light. So you get this sort of double shadow, a darker shadow and a light shadow. And it makes these kind of half circle shapes. So the next shadow is a bit lighter. And there's also some parts of the shadow that are a bit lighter because there's some reflected light in there. So I'm just gonna brush that in, add a bit of white in there so that it's a bit lighter for reflection. All right, so you're going to continue just going from light to dark, all right? So the darkest darks are going to be your shadows. The darkest darks in my picture are down in here, the shadows in between the gourds and the pumpkins. And so the entire piece is going to be in what's called a monochromatic black and white, all right? Or monochromatic grayscale, because I used one color, that blue, into my grayscale, all right? So have fun and good luck.